John Meacham on this. There are 40-some million people here are African-American whose roots go all the way back before most European Americans ever got here. And you've got 56 million Hispanic people, many of them of color. Almost 100 million people. This isn't a marginalized little group of people in New York City. This is a big chunk of this country he's talking about today when he makes fun of people and says they should go home.
And even the premise of the question, which is entirely fair, is giving him too much of a victory, giving the president too much of a victory. It's long been said, President Reagan said it quite well, that America is the one place on earth that is not about a birthright. It's about the ascent to an idea that was written in one of the most important sentences ever written in the English language, that all men were created equal and were endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. We didn't apply that fully then. We haven't applied it fully now. But that journey toward a more perfect union is the story of the country. And what the president's done here is, yet again, because I think he did it after Charlottesville, and I think he did it, frankly, when he was pushing the birther lie about President Obama, is he has joined Andrew Johnson as the most racist president in American history. Johnson, in a state message, said that African Americans were incapable of self-government and relapsed into barbarism if they weren't closely supervised. Eric Foner, the great historian of Reconstruction, says that was the single most racist statement by a president in a public paper.
Well, what about the more recent one, John? What about presidents who have used the wedge? George Bush Sr., who talked about Willie Horton, that portrait of him, the horrific picture of him they put all over the place. Reagan talking about young bucks, talking about welfare queens. Bill Clinton with Sister Souljah, and these little nuanced things like people who work hard and play by the rules. It seems like that wedge is very useful politically to get white voters to say, yeah, I'm with them, I'm not with the others.
Well, without getting into all those specifics, as you know very, very well, American politics has been defined since the Brown decision, and even before, really, but particularly since May 1954, by an attempt by politicians to put poor African Americans and brown Americans and poor white Americans pointing at each other instead of pointing up.
George Wallace.
That's the story of the racial politics of the country in the modern era. And by using culture instead of economics, the Republican Party in the modern era has done very well. It was, to be fair, because I think this is a stupid argument about historical complicity from one party or the other about now. But to be fair, white Democrats did it forever. Republicans are doing it at the moment. And it could switch again in terms of the label. The more important point is that what we have to do, faced with this, and I thought Peter's lead this morning was fantastic about, he just decided to throw a match on the kindling. And when people say, one last thing here, when people say this isn't who we are, that's not true. It is who we are. It's who we are on our worst day. And it's pointless to try to expiate ourselves from what Trump has been saying. There is a complicity, there's a national complicity in this, and the way America moves forward is 51% of the time we're with Lincoln instead of Andrew Johnson.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.